The first thing Leland Loam did at 3 in the morning was press his palm flat against the cabin wall. The fire was still burning. He could hear it behind him, the soft collapse of coals settling against the iron grate, the faint tick of metal expanding in the heat. The room should have been warm. By every measure a man could name, the room should have been warm. But under his hand the wood was moving, not shaking, not drafting through a gap in the chinking. The cold was traveling through the timber itself, moving laterally through the grain, the way water moves through cracked stone, slow and certain, and completely indifferent to the fire burning 3 feet away. Leland stood there in the dark with his palm against the wall for a long time. He was not a man who frightened easily. He had worked bad winters before, had cut wood in temperatures that froze the sap inside living trees. But this was different. This was the wall of his own house behaving like an open window. He thought about the previous January. Greta had woken before dawn with frost gathered along the inner seam of their blanket. The fire had still been burning, then too weak but alive, and the frost had formed anyway right there against the wool, right there inside the room where they slept. He had not understood it then. He had added wood, banked the coals higher, told himself the winter was just hard that year. Standing in the dark with his hand against the moving cold, he finally understood it. Wood conducted heat outward. Stone held heat inward. Those two facts sat in opposite corners of the same room, and every cabin in Sawtooth Hollow had been built from the wrong material. The walls were not shelter. They were a slow transaction, pulling warmth out of the room and handing it to the wind 1 degree at a time. A man could burn himself poor feeding that transaction and never once get ahead of it. Leland removed his hand from the wall. He stood quietly for another moment, listening to the fire and the wind outside in the particular silence of a sleeping house that did not know it was failing. Then he went back to bed and lay on his back in the dark until dawn. He did not sleep. The diner in Sawtooth Hollow smelled of burnt coffee and wet wool, and the particular exhaustion of men who had been awake since before the cold turned serious. Leland arrived at 8:30 with $10 folded in his coat pocket and sat across from a man named Pruitt, who had spent the last 2 years pulling silver out of a claim up on the North Face and had recently run out of both silver and luck. The ownership paper was already on the table when Leland sat down. He did not look at it immediately. He ordered coffee he did not intend to drink and studied the paper the way a careful man studies something he has already decided to buy. The claim was simple: a cave opening on the eastern slope of the ridge above town, accessible by a rough trail that turned to mud in spring and ice in November. 2 interior chambers, a natural chimney formation above the rear pit, an old drainage channel cut along the floor by whoever had used it before. The survey notation at the bottom described it as having no commercial value. Pruitt looked ashamed of it, in the way that men look ashamed of things they need to sell. Leland asked one question before he reached for the pen. "Does the draft run deep in there?" Pruitt frowned and said he supposed not that the air inside tended to stay still, that it was cold, but not the kind of cold that moved. Leland signed his name. The laughter started before the ink dried. He was aware of it the way a man is aware of weather, a change in pressure, a shift in the room's temperature that had nothing to do with the stove. Holt Stoll was the one who stood up. That was the thing Leland would remember later. Not the laughter itself, but the fact that Holt stood up first, made a point of it, wanted the room watching when he spoke. Holt was a carpenter. He was broad across the shoulders in the way of men who have swung heavy tools since boyhood, and he had built more cabins in this valley than any other man alive. He knew wood. He was proud of knowing wood. That pride sat in him like a load-bearing beam, central to everything else he had constructed about himself. He looked around the diner to make sure he had an audience. Then he said it loud enough for the whole room. "Only fool in Idaho buys a cave before winter." He paused the way performers pause. "Gonna dig yourself a nice little grave up there, Leland." The men laughed. Not all of them, but enough. The kind of laughter that seals a thing in place, that makes a moment into a story that will be told for years. Leland set the pen down on the table. He folded the ownership paper once along its original crease and slid it into the inside pocket of his coat. He stood up without hurrying. He picked up the coffee he had not touched, considered it briefly, and set it back down. Then he looked at Holt Stoll. "Tell me something. You know how many kinds of stone hold heat through a night without a fire?" Holt did not answer. He was still smiling, but the smile had changed slightly, the way a smile changes when a man realizes a conversation has moved somewhere he did not intend. Leland did not wait for an answer. He walked to the door, opened it, and stepped out into the gray November morning. In the corner booth, a man named Alton Bray had not laughed at all. He sat with his ledger open on the table in front of him, a heavy book bound in dark leather that he carried, the way some men carry a Bible with the quiet authority of someone who knows the contents apply to everyone in the room. He watched Leland walk out through the diner window. Then he turned back to the ledger, found the page with Leland Loam written at the top, and drew a single careful line under the balance. Not to cancel it, to mark it. Alton Bray had survived 20 years in this valley by making himself necessary. Flour and nails and lamp oil and winter credit, the whole machinery of staying alive in a place that tried to kill you every year. Every family in Sawtooth Hollow owed something to his books. That was not an accident. That was a system, and systems required maintenance. And the most dangerous thing to a system was a man who figured out how to live outside it. Leland walked home through light snow and told Greta what he had done. She read the ownership paper once, then read it again. The fire in the kitchen stove was burning the way it always burned in the morning, high and wasteful, throwing heat at the air without holding any of it. Greta folded the paper along its crease and placed it on the table between them. We spent our last $10 on a cave. Leland pulled off his wet gloves slowly. He pointed toward the bottom of the cabin door where fine snow drifted inward through the gap in soft white threads, moving steadily even with the fire going, even with the room supposedly warm. The house breathes wrong. Greta looked at the snow moving through the door gap. She had lived in this cabin for 4 winters. She knew every sound it made, every place the cold found entry. Every morning she had woken with a chill that the fire should have prevented. She understood what he was saying. She did not like it, but she understood it. She did not say anything else that morning. She put the paper in the drawer with the other documents and went back to mending the coat she had been working on before he came home. Leland watched her for a moment, then took his lantern and went up the mountain to see what $10 had actually bought. The trail to the cave took 40 minutes in good weather and longer in snow. Tuck ranged ahead, stopping every few yards to look back and confirm that Leland was still following, then bounding forward again through the thin November cover. The dog had been with Leland for 11 years. He was a big animal, deep-chested, with the kind of dense coat that cold weather could not penetrate. And he moved through mountain terrain with the calm confidence of something that had never doubted its own ability to survive. The cave opening was narrower than Leland had expected from the survey description. He had to angle his shoulders slightly to enter without scraping the stone, and he kept the lantern low to prevent the flame from touching the damp ceiling of the entry passage. The smell was cold mineral and wet earth, and something older beneath that, the particular stillness of enclosed stone that had not been disturbed in years. Tuck went in without hesitation. The entry passage opened after a dozen steps into a wider chamber, low ceiling but workable, with rough stone walls that curved upward into darkness above the lantern's reach. Leland moved the light slowly. There was an old fire pit near the center, its stone surround blackened and cracked from repeated use. Above it, soot stains ran up the wall and disappeared into a narrow gap in the rock that angled away into the mountain. A natural chimney functional, already proven by whoever had camped here before. Along the eastern wall, a long shelf of stone had been worn smooth by time or by hands. A natural bench that ran nearly the full width of the chamber. At the base of that wall, an old drainage channel had been cut into the floor, shallow but clean in its direction, carrying moisture away from the main sleeping area toward a lower crack near the entrance. Someone had thought carefully about water management. Someone had understood that a wet floor in winter was not an inconvenience but a death sentence. Leland pressed his palm against the stone floor near the fire pit. Cold. Not cold the way frozen timber was cold, not the aggressive sucking cold that pulled heat from a body on contact. This was the cold of deep rock, stable, consistent, the cold of something that had never been warm, but had also never been as cold as the air outside. There was a difference between those two things, and standing in that cave with the lantern, in the silence, and the sound of water dripping somewhere deeper in the mountain, Leland understood the difference in his hands before he could have put it into words. He spent 6 hours in that cave on the first day. He did not bring tools. He brought only the lantern and himself, and the question of whether the mountain could be made to work for him. He watched the smoke from a small test fire. He held the flame near each wall to feel for competing drafts. He measured the ceiling height with his arm extended and found that the critical zone, the layer where smoke would collect if the fire ran too hot, sat at a predictable elevation. He found the angle at which fresh air entered the entry passage and the angle at which spent air needed to exit through the chimney crack. He found in those hours of patient attention the logic of the cave. It had its own way of breathing. That way could be worked with or against. Working against it would fill the chamber with smoke. Working with it required a smaller, slower fire fed carefully allowed to breathe on the cave's own schedule. He came home after dark and ate the supper Greta had left on the stove without reheating it. She had gone to bed already. He sat alone at the kitchen table with the lantern and the ownership paper and the cold coming through the walls around him, and did not sleep for the second night in a row. The next 4 days were about stone. He carried river rocks up the trail in a rough pine sled with mule ropes stiff from frost 20 to 30 pounds per hour load, choosing flat stones that would stack level and hold contact with each other across a broad surface. Tuck followed each trip, sometimes ranging ahead, sometimes dropping back to walk beside the sled in a posture that suggested he understood the work was important without fully understanding why. Greta did not come up the mountain. She cooked and mended and kept the cabin fire going and said very little. In the evenings, she set food on the table without asking how the work was going. That silence was its own kind of language, and Leland heard it clearly. She had not stopped helping him. She had not told him to stop. She had simply not yet decided what she thought, and Greta Loam was not a woman who pretended to certainty she did not possess. On the third day, Leland built the fire too large. He had been working steadily, stacking stone beside the fire pit, placing the flat rocks in overlapping courses so that their mass would absorb and hold heat rather than simply reflecting it outward. The work had gone well, and he felt the particular energy that comes with progress, and he fed the fire more than the cave required. The flames climbed high against the stone surround. The heat rose fast into the low ceiling. The smoke changed direction. It rolled back down in heavy black waves moving along the ceiling in the wrong direction, pushed back by a pressure differential he had not yet fully accounted for. Greta, who had come up that afternoon for the first time without announcement, began coughing immediately. Tuck exploded into sharp barking, 3 hard barks, and then he was moving, pressing his body against her legs and pushing her backward away from the smoke layer, spreading through the lower half of the chamber. Before Leland had fully registered what was happening, Leland killed the fire fast. Dirt from the floor, then the water bucket, then the heel of his boot across the coals. The cave went dark except for the lantern, which threw a single small circle of yellow light in the smoke and made everything outside that circle invisible. That night, he stayed in the cave alone after Greta went home. He sat beside the cold ashes with a single candle, the smallest fire he could make, and watched the smoke move. Not a fire for warmth, but a fire for information, a way of reading the cave's preferences in miniature before committing to them at scale. He moved the candle along the floor, along the walls, held it near the chimney crack, and near the entry passage, and near each of the 4 corners of the chamber in turn. Near midnight, Greta came back up the trail with a cup of cold coffee. She set it on the stone beside him and sat down without speaking. He did not speak either. They sat together in the candlelight, in the cave dark, while the mountain held still around them. And by the time the candle had burned down 2 inches, Leland had found the fire. The cave was willing to accept. Small centered fed slowly from the eastern side, allowed to breathe upward without being pushed. It was Greta who eventually said it was time to go home. She said it quietly, not as a judgment, just as information. He nodded and banked the candle carefully and followed her down the trail by lantern light, with Tuck moving ahead of them through the dark. On the 5th day, Greta went up to the cave alone. Leland was working behind the Assayer's office that afternoon, splitting wood for wages, his hands wrapped in grease-soaked rags against the handle cold. He had been doing this for 2 weeks, coming home each evening with coins he counted out on the kitchen table while the fire ticked and the wind worked at the walls. 10 cents bought a pound of rendered hog fat, 15 bought a pound of barley. He was converting his own warmth hour by hour and swing by swing into the supplies the cave would need. Greta went up while he was working. She brought nothing with her. She sat in the cave chamber for nearly an hour in the near dark, one hand on each of the walls she could reach from the stone bench, feeling the rock the way you feel cloth for quality, slowly and without rushing. She found something that afternoon that she had not been looking for. The moisture in the chamber did not come from breath or from the entry passage the way she had expected. It came from a seam in the north wall, a place where the stone had fractured along an old stress line and where groundwater moved through the mountain during freeze and thaw. In winter, that seam would weep cold water into the chamber wall. Anyone sleeping near it would feel that cold working outward from the stone. It was a problem that had nothing to do with fire management and everything to do with where you put your bed. She went home before Leland returned from work. She did not tell him what she had found. She put the discovery away in the back of her mind, the way a careful person stores something that will be needed later intact and ready. When Leland came home that evening, she was already working at the table. She had the feed sacks laid out in front of her, and a needle threaded, and the beeswax candle lit for close work. She did not ask how the splitting had gone. She just worked steadily, without comment, and after a while Leland understood that the silence between them had changed in its character. Not closed, something more like preparation. He did not ask what had changed. He sat across the table and counted his coins in the lamplight, and they worked together in the quiet until the fire burned low. The conversation with Alton Bray happened on a Tuesday morning outside the supply warehouse with snow moving across the road in thin gray sheets. Leland had the sled loaded with 2 sacks of barley and a coil of rope and was reaching for the strap when Alton appeared in the warehouse doorway with his ledger under his arm. He leaned one shoulder against the frame in the unhurried way of a man who owns the doorway and everything beyond it. He looked at the sled. He looked at the barley and the rope and the lamp oil already lashed at the front. Planning for war. Leland tightened the strap around the barley. Planning for weather. Alton smiled at that. It was the smile of a man who has heard many explanations and found most of them inadequate. He had survived in this valley by understanding dependency, by knowing which families needed flour before they could admit it, by extending credit at precisely the moment when refusal would have been cruelest and therefore most effective. He was not a cruel man in the way that required visible malice. He was a precise man, which sometimes came to the same thing. He watched Leland secure the second strap and said nothing more. But when Leland picked up the sled rope and started down the road, Alton went back inside the warehouse and stood at his high desk for a long time before opening the ledger. What Leland Loam was buying told a story. Not the kind of buying a man made for comfort, the kind made by someone expecting to need nothing from anyone for a long stretch of time. If that worked, if Leland actually survived the winter in that cave without running short and coming to the warehouse door with his hat in his hand, other men in this valley would notice. Men who owed Alton money would notice most of all. That night, long after the warehouse lanterns went dark and the road was empty, Leland found an extra sack resting against the cave entrance beside his sled. It was salt, clean and dry, packed carefully in oiled canvas against moisture. There was no note. There were boot prints in the fresh snow, small ones leading back down the trail toward town. Tuck sniffed the sack once and sat down beside it without agitation. The posture of a dog who has identified something familiar and decided it requires no further attention. From an upstairs window above the warehouse, a light was burning. Leland picked up the salt and carried it inside without looking back down the trail. Hattie Grady had been watching Sawtooth Hollow for 40 years, long enough to know what panic buying looked like and what intelligent buying looked like. And Leland Loam was doing the second thing. She stopped him outside the general store on a windy afternoon with his sled half loaded and looked at what he had already purchased. "The cave breathes dry or wet?" she asked. "Dry enough to sleep in." She nodded at that, a slow nod that carried more information than most people's speeches. She had been born in a winter that killed livestock in their stalls and had spent her childhood learning the lessons that winter taught. Her father had survived 11 days under an overturned freight wagon in a blizzard when Hattie was 7 years old, kept alive by 4 people sharing heat under canvas, with nothing but patience and the understanding that warmth was a thing to be protected, not constantly renewed. "People die not from cold," she said. "People die because they keep trying to fight wind instead of getting out of its way." She pressed 2 jars of peach preserves into Greta's hands before she left, along with a small cloth sack of dried mustard seed, and she walked away without waiting to see the expression on either of their faces. That evening, Greta stood at the cabin window looking up toward the ridge for a long time before she said anything. When she finally spoke, she said it quietly, almost to herself more than to Leland. "Maybe it's not the worst idea you ever had." He did not say anything. He was already calculating how much rope he had left and whether it was enough to rig the second canvas layer across the entry passage before the week was out. 2 mornings later, Leland found fresh boot prints in the snow near the cave entrance, and beside the cave mouth sat a neat stack of dried juniper wood and an old rabbit snare that had been repaired with new wire. The wood was good, split clean, the pieces uniform enough to burn evenly. The snare was careful work. Someone had taken time with it. Tuck followed the boot prints uphill with his nose close to the ground, moving steadily and without urgency. And 10 minutes later, an old man stepped out from behind a rock formation above the trail and stood looking down at them. His name was Del Hatch. He had been a mining hand in an earlier decade, working claims up and down this range before his knees made that impossible. And now he lived alone on the far side of the ridge in a cabin that was not visible from the valley floor. He came down the mountain rarely. When he did come, people tended to find the experience unsettling in ways they could not easily explain. He walked into the cave the way a man walks into a room he has been in before, not exploring it, remembering it. He moved to the eastern wall without looking at the fire pit or the stacked stones or the drainage channel Leland had widened with a pickaxe. He pressed his open palm against the stone of the eastern wall, slow and deliberate, listening for something that could not be heard with ears. "The stone is warm here," he said. "Relative warm. Comes from the rock mass above. The sun reaches it by afternoon and the heat moves down through the night, on through the..." Leland said he had noticed his dog slept against that wall. Del looked at Tuck and said that animals picked warmth better than men did, and that this was one of the more useful facts about animals. Then he led Leland deeper into the cave past the main chamber into a rear section that narrowed and turned and opened again into a smaller space where the ceiling curved down low. In that smaller space, the stone walls were covered with marks. Shallow cuts made with a knife or a chisel running in parallel groups of 5 across a span of stone about a foot wide. Leland counted the groups and stopped counting at 30. "One mark for every week," Del said. He had spent a winter here years ago before anyone in the valley knew the cave existed. He had come up the mountain in November with enough food for one person and stayed until March. He rested his palm against the carved stone. "The cave holds heat," he said. His voice was quieter now, aimed at the marks rather than at Leland, but it also holds loneliness. Then he was quiet for a moment, and the quiet had a specific weight to it. He told Leland that during that winter he had asked himself every morning whether if someone came and knocked at the cave entrance, he would let them in. He had never answered that question out loud. He had never had to. No one had come. But the question had stayed with him across all the years since, the way questions do when they have gone unanswered long enough to become part of a person. He left the cave without saying goodbye, stepping out into the gray afternoon with Tuck watching him go from the entrance. Leland stood in the rear chamber for a long time after Del left, looking at those carved marks on the stone. 30 weeks. One man. He thought about the arithmetic of what he had built up here, the beans and barley, and rendered fat and lamp oil, all of it calculated for 2 people. He thought about the families in Sawtooth Hollow, the ones who owed Alton Bray money and therefore could not afford to be thought difficult or ungrateful, the ones who had laughed in the diner, and the ones who had simply looked away. He thought about the question Del had left hanging in the cold air of the rear chamber. The sky above Sawtooth Hollow had been behaving strangely for several days by the time Leland went back to the diner. Geese flew lower than he had ever seen geese fly in this valley. Wind changed direction 3 times in a single afternoon without picking up between shifts, just a pause and then a new direction, which was not how wind normally behaved. Fine powder snow drifted through the air on mornings that were otherwise clear. Tuck had stopped wiping near the cave entrance entirely. Each night, the old hound moved deeper toward the eastern wall before he circled and lay down as though drawing a line between himself and whatever was coming. Leland went to the diner and stood near the door in his wet boots and said one thing: "Double your wood before Sunday." The men looked at him the way men look at something they do not intend to take seriously. Holtstall was leaning back in his chair near the stove with a cup balanced on his knee, and that particular expression on his face, the expression of a man who has already decided how a story ends. "Hiding from Winter Underground now, are you?" Leland pulled a wet glove off one hand and looked toward the frosted window at the north end of the room. The sky beyond the glass had turned the color of old lead, flat and low and uniform, the color that preceded the kind of weather that did not negotiate. "Not hiding from winter." He paused just long enough that the room paid attention. "Hiding from wind." A few men smiled at their coffee cups. The Reverend said something about how every winter made men uneasy. Leland did not respond. He looked through the window at that sky for another moment, and then walked back out into the gray morning without looking at anyone. Across the room, Beckett Zorn watched him go. Beckett was a large man, a freight hauler who had worked the North Road camps for going on 6 seasons, and he had the kind of physical confidence that comes from having solved every problem in his life with strength and persistence. He did not smile when Leland made his prediction. He looked down at his hands instead, big hands still rough from the last haul, and turned them over once. He knew weather. He had driven loaded wagons through every kind of mountain winter this valley produced. He knew what that sky meant as well as Leland Loam did. He just did not want to be the one who admitted it first. That night in the cave, Leland sat alone after Greta had gone to sleep. He had brought the lantern and left the fire low. He looked at the food stores, at the bean sacks and the barley and the rendered fat and the lamp oil, and he did his arithmetic quietly in the dark. Enough for 2 people for 2 weeks. That was what he had built. That was the full extent of what the sled runs and the wood-splitting wages and the nights of coin counting had bought. Or enough for 6 people for 4 days. Or enough for 10 people for 2 days. He sat with those numbers for a long time in the low light. Del Hatch had spent a winter in this cave and asked himself every morning whether he would open the door if someone came. He had never had to answer. The question had stayed unanswered across 30 weeks and all the years since. Leland stood up. He walked to the entry passage and checked the canvas curtains, adjusting the lower hem so it draped properly against the cold stone floor. Then he checked the outer post, the timber he had sunk into the rock beside the entrance for exactly this purpose. He made certain the latch was not set. Not heroism, not even generosity, not exactly. Just the acknowledgement that a man who builds a shelter and then locks it from the inside has built a different thing than he intended. He had not come up this mountain in November to build a different thing than he intended. He went back to the fire and sat down beside it and listened to the mountain breathe around him until the coals burned low and the cave held its warmth without any help from the flame. The storm did not arrive with snow. It arrived with silence first, and then with pressure, and then with a sound that had no name in ordinary weather. Leland was sitting near the entry passage when the oil lamp flame bent sideways without any draft to move it. It held that angle for 3 full seconds, pointing west as though something enormous had passed by outside and displaced the air. Then it straightened again. Tuck was on his feet before the flame had finished moving, ears up, body rigid, oriented toward the cave entrance, with the absolute attention of an animal that has stopped thinking and started knowing. Then the mountain heard it. A sound came down from the ridge above the cave like nothing Leland had heard in 6 winters in this valley. Not thunder, which had a rolling quality, a sense of distance and approach. This was immediate, a deep metallic concussion that traveled through the stone under his feet before it reached his ears, as though the mountain itself had been struck. The canvas curtains at the entry passage snapped inward on a pressure wave, and then the wind hit not gradually but all at once, a full assault that drove hard snow sideways past the entrance in a solid wall of white motion. Greta had been lying down near the stone bench. She sat up fast, and in the lantern light, her face was very still, in the way faces go still when fear has not yet found its expression. The small fire in the pit held. The stone that surrounded it had been absorbing heat for 6 hours, and it did not surrender that heat simply because the world outside had turned violent. The canvas at the entrance bucked and snapped and strained against its lashing, but the main chamber behind it remained almost untouched. No rushing draft, no crosswind moving at floor level, only the controlled sound of the flame and the distant, continuous violence of the storm testing the mountain from outside. Leland sat without moving for a long time, listening to the storm. Try the cave, the way a man tries a locked door, working each potential weakness in sequence, looking for the one that would give. The cave gave nothing, and that was the thing that frightened him. Not the storm itself, not the sound or the cold or the force of it pressing against the stone above their heads. What frightened him was the calm inside the chamber, the steady flame, the warmth that sat in the stone bench and refused to move. If this cave was this quiet while the storm was still building toward its full strength, then the town below was already in a condition that the people inside those log cabins had not yet fully understood. Greta was looking at him across the lantern light. He could see both things in her face now. The fear was there, plainly visible, but something else had taken up residence alongside it, something that had not been there before, not in the diner, and not when he had laid the ownership paper on the kitchen table, and not during any of the cold mornings when she had set food out without asking questions. She had seen the flame hold. She had felt the stone bench under her hand and understood what it meant that the bench was still warm. She had been watching this cave work for 9 days, And now she was watching it work under conditions that were trying to destroy it, and it was still working. He did not say anything. He turned back toward the entry passage and kept listening. The storm entered its second hour without weakening. Delhatch arrived sometime before midnight, stepping through the canvas curtains, with snow packed into every fold of his coat and a layer of ice across the front of his beard that he broke off in pieces with his fingers. He stood inside the entry passage for a moment while the warmth of the main chamber reached him, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has been very cold for a long time and has just stopped being cold. Church roof split open, he said. Wind took it from the south side first. He moved further into the chamber and sat down against the wall, pulling off his outer layer and laying it near the heat of the stone bench to dry. If this wind keeps 3 days, he said, people start dying inside their houses. Leland said nothing. Dell looked at him steadily. You came to tell me I should help them. The old man shook his head once. No, he looked around the chamber at the banked fire and the steady flame and the stone shelf radiating its stored warmth into the air. I came because your cave is warmer than my cabin. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. The storm pressed against the mountain outside with a sound like continuous freight traffic, load after load moving through the dark. Then Dell said it quietly, aimed at the fire rather than at Leland. But yes, you should think about it. Leland already had been thinking about it. He had been thinking about nothing else since the lamp flame bent sideways. The second day of the storm brought the first rescue. Leland saw the shape from the cave entrance during a brief lull in the blowing snow, a dark form moving wrong against the white slope below, not walking but stumbling, losing ground with each step, angling toward the rock field east of the main trail. He had his coat on before he had fully formed the decision to go, and Tuck was already through the canvas and into the white before Leland had finished tying the last fastening. The wind outside was a different thing from the wind described in ordinary language. It did not push. It occupied. It filled the space between a man's clothes and his skin and went to work on the heat there with complete efficiency and no regard for effort or intention. Leland leaned into it and moved downslope using the rock formations as partial cover where he could, following Tuck, who had already located the shape and was working around it in tight circles, pressing close and backing off and pressing close again. Hattie Grady had made it 3/4 of the way up the trail before her right hand stopped working. The glove had soaked through sometime earlier, and the cold had done its work quietly the way cold did its best work, without announcement. She was down on one knee when Leland reached her, still trying to rise, still pushing against the slope with a hand that could no longer feel the ground it was pressing against. Getting her back up the trail, with the wind driving against both of them from the northwest, was the hardest physical work Leland had done since he was a younger man. Tuck understood his role without instruction. The dog planted himself on Hattie's downhill side and pushed steadily inward with his full weight, countering the wind's effort to pivot her off the slope. 3 times the gust came hard enough to stop all forward progress entirely, and Leland stood with his arms around the old woman and his boots finding purchase in the frozen ground and simply held position until the gust passed. Inside the cave, Greta had already built the fire up to the right level before they came through the entrance. Not high, the right level, which was not the same thing. She had positioned Hattie's spot before they arrived, had cleared the stone bench nearest the fire pit, and had a dry wool blanket ready and the water already set to heat. She worked without being directed, without asking questions about condition or cause. She placed Hattie beside the bench rather than directly against the fire, and the reason for that placement was something she had carried since the afternoon she sat alone in this cave and listened to Hattie tell the story of her father under the freight wagon. Steady warmth, the kind that moved at the body's own pace, patient and consistent. Dell worked on Hattie's frozen hand, and Greta removed the soaked outer layers, and the cave did what it had been designed to do. Hattie came back to herself slowly, the way consciousness returns after cold has driven it deep in increments rather than all at once. Her fingers moved first, then her eyes focused. Then when she was warm enough to feel things clearly, the tears came. She did not explain them. She rested her fingers against the stone bench and felt the warmth that lived there without any active fire feeding it, and the tears ran down her face, and she did not try to stop them. She looked around the chamber, at the food stored off the floor, at the water that had not frozen at the lantern light, holding steady in the draft-free air. You built a winter stomach under the mountain, she said. On the 4th night of the storm, Hattie found the condensation problem before anyone else did. She had been lying awake near the sleeping corner, which was how she discovered it, A thin film of ice had formed on the ceiling above the corner during the coldest part of the previous night, and now as the fire warmed the air, that ice was releasing its moisture in small, cold drops that fell onto the blankets below, with a rhythm that had been building for an hour before she registered it as a pattern rather than coincidence. Tuck was already awake and had moved away from his usual position without anyone noticing, relocating himself closer to the fire pit with a low sound in his chest that was not quite a growl. Leland looked up at the ceiling when Hattie pointed. He could see the moisture track clearly now, the dark, irregular line where the ice had formed and was surrendering. He began working through the problem, methodically running through the options in order. Greta spoke before he reached the third option. She crossed to the north wall and placed her palm against the stone at floor level, about 2 feet from the corner. Cold water was moving through the rock there, she said. Not from the air above, from the ground below, coming through the fractured seam she had located weeks earlier. On the afternoon she had come up here alone and sat in the dark and learned the cave's particular language. Leland stopped and looked at her. She had known about that seam since before the storm. She had put the information away and waited, and now she was producing it at exactly the moment it was needed, fully formed and immediately applicable. That was not luck. That was a different kind of preparation than the kind he had been doing with sled loads and coin counting, but it was preparation nonetheless. He did what she suggested. He moved additional heated stones along the base of the north wall, creating a band of warmth at floor level that interrupted the cold transmission before it could reach the ceiling above the sleeping corner. Then together, without speaking much, he and Greta shifted the bed frame across the cave floor while water dripped steadily in the dark behind them. The frame was heavy and the footing was uneven, and it took longer than it should have, but they did not stop until it was positioned correctly. When they were done, Greta did not say anything about having known first. She went back to her side of the fire and arranged the blankets and lay down. Leland looked at the cave around him, the fire pit, the stone bench, the food stores, the water that had not frozen, the drainage channel still doing its work, the canvas curtains still holding against the storm that had been trying to remove them for 4 days. He had built this. He and Greta had built this. The distinction between those two statements had narrowed considerably since the afternoon he had come home with a folded ownership paper and pointed at the snow drifting through the bottom of the door. Leroy Falk came on the 5th day. Tuck heard him before anyone else and gave the alert growl, not the sharp bark of alarm, but the low sustained tone that meant something was approaching that was not yet identified. Leland was at the entry passage before the sound of knocking reached him. Leroy came through the canvas with Ida held against his chest under 2 quilts that had frozen into a single stiff panel. She was not moving in the way children did not move when their temperature had dropped past the point where the body conserved energy by withdrawing from the extremities. Her lips had been blue for several hours, Leroy said. The chimney on their cabin had ice shut in the night, and by the time he understood what was happening, the smoke had already done its work and breathing had become the first problem rather than the cold. Leland took Ida from Leroy's arms without ceremony and carried her to the stone bench, while Greta was already moving, had already set the water to heat. Leroy stood in the entry to the main chamber and saw the cave clearly for the first time. He had heard about it, of course. The whole valley had heard about the $10 cave, had heard Holt Stoll's line about the fool in Idaho had laughed, or at least smiled, or at least not objected when the laughing was happening. Leroy had not laughed, but he had not stood up either. He had sat in the diner with his coffee and his debts and made no sound, and that silence had been its own kind of agreement. He stood in the entries and looked at the food shelves stacked above the floor, the firewood stored dry, the water that had not frozen, the warmth that sat in the stone and released itself steadily into the air without demanding constant fuel to sustain it. The whole arrangement looked like something a careful mind had worked out over time, not a hiding place, but a system, not desperation, but preparation. He sat down beside Ida and did not speak for a long while. "I should have stood up for you at the diner," he finally said. His voice was flat with a specific kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with the cold. Leland adjusted the heated stone beside Ida's blanket. "You left that bundle of pitchwood beside my sled." Leroy went very still. He had told no one about that. Not his wife, not his neighbors, not anyone in the valley. He had gone out in the early morning 3 weeks ago and left the wood and walked home in the dark, and he had not spoken of it because speaking of it would have required explaining it, and explaining it would have required admitting things about himself that he was not ready to say out loud. Leland said nothing more about it. He went back to managing the fire and left Leroy sitting with his daughter in his silence. Color came back to Ida slowly, first in her fingertips, then in the line of her jaw, and finally several hours after Leroy had arrived in her lips. She woke once and looked around the cave without alarm and asked for water, and Greta brought it, and she drank and went back to sleep. Holt Stoll arrived the following morning, carrying Birch through waist-deep snow. He did not arrive the way Leroy had arrived. Leroy had arrived frightened and grateful, a man who needed something and knew it and was willing to be humble about needing it. Holt arrived as a man who had run out of every alternative before accepting that he had to come here, and that was a different and heavier thing to carry. He came through the canvas and stopped. He did not look at the food shelves or the water or the fire or the stone bench. He looked at Leland. I laughed at this place. 3 words that had been sitting in him. Leland could see for however many hours he had been standing in his deteriorating cabin, watching Birch's breathing change, and knowing that every option except the one he had been refusing to consider was no longer available. Leland nodded once. Nothing else followed. No speech, no recrimination, no moment of acknowledged triumph. Greta moved to Birch immediately, and Tuck, without instruction from anyone, lowered himself onto the bedroll beside the boy and pressed his full weight gently against Birch's shaking body, using his own heat steadily and without drama. That was all. But that night, Holt still sat awake beside his son's sleeping form and watched the cave work, watched the stone bench hold its warmth and the small fire maintain its steady output, and the canvas curtains absorb the storm's force without giving ground. And sometime before dawn, he understood something that 20 years of building cabins and laying floor joists and raising roof beams had never taught him. Sound timber could not defeat bad physics. The most beautiful cabin he had ever built, fitted joint by joint, chinked against every gap, raised with the best wood the valley had ever produced, had been beating itself against a physical reality it could not overcome from the first day its walls went up. He understood this alone in the dark, with his son breathing steadily nearby and the storm loud against the mountain above. When he thought no one was watching, he put his face in one rough hand. Del Hatch, sitting motionless against the far wall with his eyes closed, did not move. The 6th day of the storm brought Ova Bray. 3 slow, careful knocks against the outer posts, the kind of knocking that was trying not to alert too many people at once. Tuck moved aside from the entry passage without any prompting, a response that no one in the cave missed. Dogs did not move aside for strangers. Ova came through the canvas with a flour sack across one shoulder and 2 glass jars held tight against her body under her coat, frost on her eyelashes. One side of her face had lost sensation from the wind on the trail up. She moved to the supply shelves and began unloading without being asked. Flour, rendered hog fat, a sealed jar of cough preparation she had made herself from pine resin and wild honey, the recipe something her mother had taught her for exactly this kind of winter. Greta looked at the supplies and understood immediately what they represented. Not abundance, sacrifice. These were things taken from somewhere that could not easily spare them, brought here at a cost that had not finished being calculated yet. What happened? Greta said. Ova kept her eyes on the shelf while she arranged what she had brought. My father caught me taking from the storeroom. The cave went quiet in the particular way it went quiet when information arrived that reorganized everything else. Ova repeated her father's words exactly in his cadence, with his particular way of making statements sound like the closing of a door. If you walk out that door, don't come back. And then she told them what most people in the valley had begun to suspect without fully believing. Alton Bray had supplies beneath the warehouse floor. Not a week's worth, not 2 weeks. Enough for the whole valley to see the other side of this storm without anyone going short. Flour and salt pork and beans and lamp oil, all of it, stored in the dry space below the floorboards, and none of it moving to the families whose children were freezing in inadequate cabins a few streets away. He released supplies only to families whose names were current in his ledger. Debt was the admission ticket. Families who had managed to stay out of his books or who had fallen behind in ways that made them less useful as ongoing clients received nothing. No one in the cave cursed him after hearing this. Cursing would have been easier than what the cave actually filled with, which was the heavier silence of people who had trusted a system without examining its terms and had now seen the full terms clearly for the first time. Greta stepped forward and put both arms around Ova without speaking. The younger woman stood rigid for several seconds, her whole body holding the posture of someone who had not expected to be held and was not certain what to do with it. Then the wind came through the canvas in a long, low moan, steady and without end, across the mountain above them, and Ova's breath changed and she began to cry, not loudly. The way a person cried who had been carrying something alone for a long time and had just been relieved of it without warning. The night of the sixth day was when Beckett Zorn stood up. The cave held more than 10 people by then. Too many breaths, too much weight on the food stores, too many eyes tracking every movement Leland made toward the supply shelves. Hunger made the space smaller and the sounds louder. Spoons against tin, water dripping from thawed boot leather, the particular rustle of sacking being checked and rechecked by hands that already knew what was in it. Leland measured the pinto beans as he always had, equal portions without exception. He had been doing this the same way for 6 days, and he was going to keep doing it this way because the alternative was not a system, it was an argument that never ended. Beckett Zorn held his tin cup and looked at what was in it. He was a large man by any measure, broad through the chest and long in the arm. A man who had spent years doing work that consumed calories at a rate ordinary living could not match. He knew his own body the way people who worked hard knew their bodies as a tool with specific fuel requirements, and what was in his cup was not enough. "I am bigger than half the people in this cave." No one responded. Leland handed the next portion to Greta without varying the measurement. Beckett set his cup down on the stone with a sound that was not quite a slam, but was not casual either. "I work harder. I need more." He stood up. He was very large when he stood up, and the cave, which was not a small space, registered his standing as a change in atmosphere. Holtstol was on his feet and between them before anyone else in the cave had fully processed what was happening. He did not raise his hands. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood in the space between Beckett and Leland, in the posture of a man who had made a decision and was prepared to maintain it. Delhatch lifted his eyes from the fire. He spoke in the same tone he used for everything, even and without emphasis, which made the words land harder than volume would have. "I watched 2 brothers kill each other over dried beans in Wyoming." The cave went still. Even the storm outside seemed to recede for a moment, as though the mountain had leaned in to hear what came next. Then a voice came from near the rear wall. "Dad, stop." Vern Zorn was 17 years old and had his father's frame and none of his father's certainty about his own rightness. He stood with his untouched bowl held in both hands and looked at his father with an expression that Beckett Zorn had never seen on his son's face before. Shame was part of it, but it was shame that had turned outward rather than inward, shame on behalf of rather than about. And Beckett understood the difference in the moment he saw it, because the difference was written on his son's face as plainly as a sentence. He sat down. The cave returned to eating. Leland continued dividing the beans with the same hands and the same measurements, and no one said anything more about portions or fairness or the relative caloric needs of large men. But that night, Vern did not sit beside his father. He went to the far side of the fire pit and settled near Birch's stall, and Tuck, stretched out between the 2 boys in the way of an animal that understood its own heat, was a resource worth distributing thoughtfully. Beckett sat against the north wall in the dark and did not sleep, watching his son's back across the low fire. And the distance between them in that small warm cave was the particular distance that opens between people when one of them has seen the other clearly for the first time and is not yet certain what to do with what they have seen. The 7th day brought the accounting. Leland had been doing the arithmetic in pieces for days, checking a bag and then not checking it again, postponing the full calculation the way a man postponed a diagnosis he suspected would not be good. On the morning of the 7th day, he did it completely without postponing, because the supplies had reached the point where postponing was just a way of wasting the time the accurate number would have given him. He looked at every bag and every jar and every stack of wood and did the math. 3 days, he said, maybe 2.5 if the wind picks up again. He said it to the cave rather than to any particular person, and the cave heard it the way a room heard hard news, with a silence that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of comprehension. Greta was sitting beside him. She did not flinch from the number. She had been calculating it herself and had arrived within half a day of his figure. "Do you regret opening the cave?" she asked. Leland looked around the chamber. Birch Stall was sleeping without coughing for the first time in 3 days. Ida Falk's breathing was steady and clean. Hattie Grady rested under patched blankets near the warm bench. Del Hatch's slow snoring was a sound that Leland had come to think of as part of the cave's own rhythm. And then there was Tuck, who had abandoned the eastern wall where he had slept every night of the storm and had moved instead to the gap between the sleeping corner and the entry passage lying across the drafts that still found their way past the canvas, blocking the weakest cold with his body so that none of it reached the children on the other side. Not tonight, Leland said. He sounded for the first time since the storm began like a man who was tired enough to break. But he did not break. He banked the fire to its careful level and set the morning's first measurement of beans to soak and sat in the low light of the cave that was running out of time and waited for the 8th day to arrive. Before dawn on the 8th day, Beckett Zorn was already standing at the entry passage in the dark, tying rope around his body in a slow, deliberate way, as though he had been working through the knots in his mind for hours before his hands started moving. Leland woke at the sound of the lashing and watched from his blankets without speaking. Beckett did not turn around. There was a woodpile at the abandoned stonecutter's cabin on the western slope. He kept working the knots. I hauled freight past it 3 times this autumn. Good split wood under a lean-to sheltered from the west. I know exactly where it is. He tied the last knot and checked it with both hands. I know the way in the dark. Then he pushed through the canvas and into the storm before Leland could say a single word, and the canvas fell back into place behind him, and the cave was quiet again with the sound of sleeping people and the storm and the fire that had perhaps 3 days left in it. Vern woke an hour later and looked toward the entry passage and understood, without anyone telling him where his father had gone and why. He sat with his blanket around his shoulders and his untouched breakfast in his lap and watched the canvas curtains move in the drafts that his father had left through and did not speak and waited. Beckett Zorn came back 4 hours after he left. He came through the canvas slowly, the way men moved when their body had done everything it could, and was now operating on something beneath physical energy, some older and more stubborn fuel that did not have a clean name. The left side of his face had gone a deep, alarming red from the wind exposure and would not fully warm for another 2 days. His hands, when he finally unclenched them from the rope bundle, showed the damage the cold had done in the 4 hours he had been out in it. Raw across the knuckles, the skin split at the base of 2 fingers, where the cold had found the thinnest places and worked through them. He was carrying wood, not an enormous amount, not enough to change the arithmetic by more than 2 days at the current burn rate. But it was dry split juniper from under a protected lean-to, and it was real, and he had gone out into a storm that had already killed the valley's certainty about its own survival and come back with it, and that was the full and complete fact of the matter. Vern was on his feet before his father had cleared the entry passage. He did not say anything. He crossed to where Beckett was standing and took the bundle from his father's arms without asking. And the transfer of weight between them, the simple physical act of a son taking a burden from a father's hands, lasted only a few seconds and contained more than either of them would have been able to put into words if anyone had asked. Vern carried the wood to the stack beside the wall and set it down carefully piece by piece, making it neat in the way that people made things neat when neatness was the only form of respect they had available. Beckett sat down on the nearest stone and pressed both palms flat against the bench surface. Leland watched the color change in the man's hands as the stored warmth reached them, the red deepening and then slowly moderating towards something closer to living skin. He said nothing. He went to the water bucket and poured a cup and brought it to Beckett and set it beside him. That was the only conversation that needed to happen. Later that morning, when the storm outside showed its first sign of fatigue, a slight irregularity in the wind's rhythm, a gap between gusts where before there had been no gaps, Leland sat beside Greta near the low fire and felt the weight of the cave's arithmetic shift incrementally in a direction that was not yet hope but was no longer its opposite. The 9th day arrived not with drama but with absence. The sound that had been constant for over a week began to develop gaps. Not long ones at first, a few seconds here and there, where the roaring above the mountain softened to something more like a sustained pressure, and then to something that could almost be called wind in the ordinary sense of the word. People in the cave, when they woke to those gaps the way they had been waking to every change in the storm's character immediately and with full attention, lying still and listening to see if the quiet would hold. It did not hold not at first. The storm pushed back twice in the early morning hours, reasserting itself with enough force to make the canvas snap and to send a thin, cold infiltration through the entry passage that Leland felt from his position near the fire pit. But the second assault was shorter than the first, and the quiet that followed it was longer. And by the time the gray morning light began finding its way around the edges of the canvas curtains, it was possible to believe, carefully and without committing to it too fully, that the worst was finished. Delhatch was already awake when the others began stirring. He was sitting in his usual position against the wall with his hands resting on his knees, watching the fire, and his expression had the particular quality of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing and has just seen it arrive. Hattie Grady sat up from her blankets and listened to the changed sound outside for a long moment. Then she looked at Leland and said nothing, but the look said what she had been observing since the afternoon she had pressed her hands against the stone bench and wept that the cave had held, that everything built here had done what it was built to do, and that this was not luck. One by one, they moved toward the entry passage. Ida went through the canvas first because she was the smallest and moved fastest, and no one had the energy to establish any other order. She stepped out into the thin winter morning on the slope above Sawtooth Hollow and immediately lost her footing on the crusted snow and went down sideways with a sound that no one in the cave had heard in 9 days. She laughed. It came out of her before she had fully registered, falling a pure involuntary burst of sound that had nothing in it except the fact of being alive and being 9 years old and finding the world suddenly funny after a very long time of the world being nothing of the kind. She lay on her back in the snow and laughed, and the sound traveled up the slope and came back off the stone above the cave entrance and reached the people standing in the opening, one after another. Holtstall turned his face away from the sound. No one mentioned the wetness in his eyes. There was a shared understanding in the cave's entry passage at that moment that some things did not require acknowledgement to be fully present, and this was one of them. Leland looked down at Sawtooth Hollow. The valley below had been remade. Not repaired, not damaged in the ordinary sense that implied something recoverable within a season, but fundamentally remade by 9 days of force that had not been interested in what the valley preferred. Roofs had failed in the night, and their wreckage lay distributed by wind across the fields and roads surrounding them. Fences had disappeared entirely beneath drifts so hard and dense they would not soften until well into March. The livery stable at the south end of town had lost its entire eastern wall, the boards pulled away cleanly from the framing by wind that had gotten under the eave and worked upward with patient structural intelligence. The chimneys were what Leland noticed most. Most of them were dark. Not all, but most, and the ones that showed smoke showed thin and tentative threads that told the story of people burning their last fuel, carefully measuring it out against an uncertain future. No longer certain the storm was truly finished. Greta stood beside him, looking down at all of it, and he could feel her taking the inventory, the same way he was taking it, building a picture of what the valley had lost and what it would need in the hours and days immediately ahead. Holtstall said quietly, and to no one in particular, that he needed to go down and see about his family. He went. Leroy Falk went with him. Hattie Grady said she would follow at her own pace, which everyone understood to mean she would arrive after everyone else, but would arrive ready to work. Leland let them go. He turned back into the cave. Before he went to the rear chamber, Holtstall did something no one expected. He went back into the cave alone, taking the small thermometer he had carried in his trade coat for years, a brass instrument he used to gauge wood expansion on finish work. He moved to the stone bench near the dead fire pit, pressed the thermometer against the air beside the rock, and waited. He read the number twice to be certain, 62 degrees Fahrenheit. The fire had been out since the previous evening. Outside, the temperature was well below 20. He set his palm flat against the bench surface and held it there for a long moment. The stone was warm, not the fading warmth of a thing that had recently been heated and was cooling rapidly. The deep, steady warmth of a mass that had absorbed heat over days and was releasing it slowly at a rate that had nothing to do with any fire currently burning. Holtstall had built more structures in this valley than any other man. He had worked with every grade of timber the Idaho ranges produced. He had never in all of that work produced anything that behaved like this stone bench on a morning after the fire was dead. He folded the thermometer back into his coat pocket. Delhatch was watching him from the far wall. Neither of them said anything. Holt walked back out into the morning and did not speak of the numbers to anyone that day. But when he went home, he sat at his workbench for a long time before he picked up any tools, thinking about the cabins he would build differently when the ground thawed. Leland went alone to the rear chamber with the lantern he no longer truly needed in the morning light that now came clearly through the entry passage. The carved marks were there on the wall the same as they had always been, Dell's 30 weeks accumulated in patient parallel lines across a section of stone that had been recording winter survival in this mountain long before Leland Loam arrived with $10 and a question about drafts. He stood in front of the marks for a while. Then he took the knife from his coat pocket and found a clean section of stone beside Dell's record and made one mark. A single line, shallow and precise, cut into the rock with the particular care of someone who understood that this mark meant something different from all the marks beside it. Dell had cut his marks in isolation, one man counting the weeks of his own endurance. This mark was cut in a cave that had, at its peak, held more than 10 people through the worst storm in the valley's recent memory. One mark, not 30, not 9, one. The scrape of the blade against stone echoed softly through the rear chamber and then was gone. Dell's voice came from the shadows near the entry to the rear passage. Only one. Leland did not turn around immediately. He looked at the single mark beside the long record of Dell's winter, the new line small and clean against the old stone. Yes. He turned and walked back toward the light at the front of the cave, and Dell followed without asking anything more. Holt Stoll reached the warehouse before the crowd did, but not by much. The truth about what Alton Bray had been holding through the 9 days of the storm had moved through the valley with the particular speed that important truths moved in small communities, person to person in the first hours after the storm broke. Each telling, carrying the emotional weight of the teller's own 9 days of cold and fear and fuel rationing. By the time Leland came down the mountain with Dell and Greta behind him, there were already a dozen people standing in the street outside the warehouse. Holt was at the door. He had knocked once hard enough to send frost cascading from the iron hardware along the doorframe, and he was standing back now and waiting with the expression of a man who had decided what he was going to do, regardless of what opened the door. Alton Bray opened it himself. He was dressed carefully, which suggested he had been awake for some time and had made deliberate choices about how to present himself for whatever was coming. His ledger was not in evidence. He stood in the doorway of his warehouse with his hands at his sides and looked at the people assembled in his street, and he was, for perhaps the first time in his life, in this valley, a man without an advantage. Behind him, visible through the open door, were the supplies: barrels of flour, salt pork in sealed containers, beans in burlap sacks stacked 4 high against the interior wall, lamp oil in sealed tins arranged along the shelving with the orderly efficiency of someone who had been expecting to distribute them on his own terms and in his own time. Enough to have kept families alive and warm through the entirety of what had just happened. Enough that none of the children who had been carried half-frozen up a mountain trail to sleep in a cave needed to have been carried anywhere. Holt did not shout. He had done his shouting privately alone in the dark, bent over his son's sleeping form with his face in his hands. What was left now was something quieter and more final. He looked at the supplies visible behind Alton, and then looked at Alton and said nothing for a moment that stretched long enough to mean everything. Leroy Falk was standing 2 feet to Holt's left. He had owed Alton Bray money for 3 years, and that debt had shaped his behavior at the diner and at the store and in every public conversation in this valley where Alton Bray's name came up. He had stayed quiet at the right moments and agreed at the wrong ones, and the debt had purchased all of that compliance at a rate he had never fully calculated until now. "You let people starve," Leroy said. His voice was level, the levelness of someone who has burned through anger into something colder and more permanent. Alton began the defense he had presumably been preparing since the storm began showing signs of ending. He spoke about property and preparation and the responsibility of a man to protect what he had built. He spoke about the choices people made and the consequences of those choices. He was not a stupid man, and the argument was not without internal logic, the logic of a system that had worked for him for 20 years, and that he had genuinely mistaken for a moral position. No one in the street responded to it. Leland had been standing at the back of the gathering listening. He moved forward now, not quickly, not with any theatrical weight, just through the crowd, until he was close enough that Alton could see his face clearly. He looked once at the supplies inside the warehouse. Then he looked at the street, at the ruined roof lines visible over the adjacent buildings, at the chimneys, still cold and dark in the thin morning air. "You protected inventory," he said. His eyes moved back to Alton and held there without heat or performance. Not people. The street was quiet after that. Not the quiet of people waiting for more to be said, but the quiet of people who had heard enough and had moved past the point where more words would change anything. The verdict had been delivered not by Leland or Holt or Leroy, but by the storm itself, by 9 days of evidence that had left its record across the valley in the form of rooting roofs and frozen chimneys and children carried up mountain trails in the dark. Alton Bray looked at his daughter. Ova was standing beside Leland Loam. She was not looking at her father. She was looking at the street, at the same ruined chimneys and collapsed structures that Leland had indicated. In the distance between where she was standing and where her father was standing was not a physical distance that could be measured in feet. It was the other kind of distance, the kind that opens between people when one of them has seen something clearly that the other one cannot afford to see, and both of them know it, and neither of them can change it. Alton said nothing more. The warehouse opened that morning. It did not open according to Alton Bray's ledger. Holt Stahl and Leroy Falk and two other men carried the supplies out into the street, and the distribution happened the way Leland had been dividing beans in the cave, by need, and without exception, with no reference to any book that tracked what anyone owed. Alton stood back from this process. He watched it happen from the doorway of his warehouse with the expression of a man who was witnessing the dismantling of something he had spent 20 years building and who understood that the dismantling was not temporary. Hattie Grady arrived at the warehouse while the distribution was still in progress, moving at her own pace as promised, her right hand still wrapped in cloth from the frostbite. She did not go to the supplies. She went directly to where 3 families with young children were waiting and began organizing them by priority, the way a person organized things who had been managing emergencies longer than most people in the valley had been alive. On her way past Leland, she pressed something into his hand without stopping. It was a jar of peach preserves, one of the original 2 she had given Greta before the storm. The seal was unbroken. For later, she said, moving past him without slowing. Leland looked at the jar in his hand for a moment, then put it in his coat pocket and went back to work. The weeks that followed the storm were the hardest kind of hard work. The kind without the clarity that emergency provided, the slow grinding work of repair in cold weather with limited materials and tired people. Roads were opened one section at a time. New chimney caps were fabricated from scavenged metal. Families doubled up in the structures that had survived intact, while the ones that had not were assessed for what could be salvaged and what needed to be rebuilt from the foundation. Leland moved through the valley doing the same work he had done in the cave, one problem at a time, one correction at a time. He went to cabins with his tools and found the specific failure in each one and addressed it directly without general commentary. A door gap narrowed with a strip of leather, a stove repositioned away from the outside wall, a sleeping loft lowered away from the ceiling where cold collected, a wood supply moved undercover. Holt Stahl worked alongside him most days. The carpenter said less than he had ever said in his life during those weeks, which for a man who had made a public declaration in a diner room was perhaps the most significant change the storm had produced in him. He worked and watched and absorbed what he was learning, and occasionally when Leland paused to assess a problem, Holt would offer an observation that showed he had understood not just the specific fix but the principle behind it, and Leland would nod and they would continue. Alton Bray did not participate in the rebuilding work. He was present in the valley in a physical sense, but absent from it in the way that mattered, which was the way of a man who had been the center of a system and was learning in real time that the system had reorganized itself around a different center. His ledger still existed. The debts recorded in it were technically still valid, but the weight those debts had carried, the social leverage, the quiet authority that had shaped 100 conversations and transactions across 20 years, that weight was gone. Not because anyone had formally declared it gone, because the storm had shown everyone in the valley what the ledger was actually worth when the temperature dropped below zero and a child needed warmth. Ova Bray went to work in the spring for Hattie Grady, learning the management of a property and a household from a woman who had survived more winters than most people in the valley had been alive. She visited her father occasionally briefly and without warmth, and the visits had the character of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than answering a need. Alton watched these visits end and watched his daughter walk back down his street toward Hattie's house. And if he understood what he had traded for his stocked warehouse floor, he gave no external sign of it. The name Loam Hollow did not come from any meeting or formal designation. Names like that never did in places like this. It simply began appearing in the way people referred to the cave first as a description and then as a proper noun until the point at which everyone used it and no one remembered when they had started. By the following autumn, the cave had been permanently modified to serve its new function. The food shelves that Leland had built for his family's survival had been extended and reinforced. A second canvas layer had been added to the entry passage. The drainage channel had been cleaned and widened. Dry wood was stacked under a protected lean-to, built against the cave's eastern exterior, covered with oiled canvas that shed moisture and kept the supply available regardless of weather. Every family in the valley contributed something to those stores before the cold season, not because anyone required it, because the 9 days had changed what people understood about the relationship between individual preparation and collective survival, and the change was not theoretical. It was written in the memory of every person who had been inside that cave. Hattie Grady organized the autumn provisioning with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting her whole life for a community to be organized correctly. She kept a simple record, not a ledger of debts, but a list of what was stored and what was needed with no names attached to either column except as logistics. One evening in early October, Greta stood at the cave entrance and watched the provisioning happen. Families coming up the trail with their contributions, children running loose on the slope, while the adults worked the cave, receiving everything the way it received everything, steadily and without complaint. Tuck was among the children, or rather, the children were around Tuck, running after the old dog and laughing when he declined to be caught with the dignified unhurriedness of an animal that had earned the right to set its own pace. Greta thought about it the morning after the diner, when she had read the ownership paper twice and said those 8 words across the kitchen table. She thought about sitting alone in the dark of this cave with her hands on the stone walls, learning something she had not yet been asked to learn. She thought about the night she had moved the heated stones to the north wall base, while cold water dripped in the dark behind her, and Leland had looked at her in a way he had not looked at her before. She did not say any of this aloud. She stood at the entrance and watched the provisioning until the last family had come up and added their portion and gone back down the trail, and then she went inside and helped Leland arrange what had been brought so that it would keep through the winter without loss. That was how the work happened now, without ceremony, without anyone needing to explain to anyone else what was being done or why. In the spring, when the melt came and the trails softened and the daylight held longer each afternoon, Leland went into the rear chamber one morning then with the lantern that had become more habit than necessity. He stood for a while looking at the carved marks on the wall, at Dell's long column of weeks and the single line he had added beside them. He was still standing there when Dell appeared at the passage entry. The old man looked at the marks and then at Leland and asked the same question he had asked before with the same unadorned directness. Still only one. Leland did not answer immediately. He was listening to something from outside the cave coming in through the passage, and the half-open canvas carried on the spring air that had been losing its winter edge for several weeks now. Greta's voice first, and then children's voices, and then Tuck's particular sound. Not the alert bark or the working bark, but the sound the dog made when he was running for the pleasure of running in good weather with no destination and no purpose except the fact of spring and a slope and legs that still worked. Leland placed his palm flat against the cave wall beside the marks. The stone was different in spring from what it was in winter. Not warm exactly, but holding a faint trace of solar heat that had worked its way down through the mountain above the long, slow warmth of a season rather than an hour, patient and deep. He stayed like that for a while, listening to the sounds outside. Then the small, tired smile came, the one that had nothing to do with performance or satisfaction or the particular pleasure of having been right when others said you were wrong. The smile of a man who had been afraid and careful and wrong sometimes and right when it mattered, and was now standing in a cave in an Idaho spring with his hand on a warm wall, listening to his wife laugh and a dog run and children chase each other through the mud and patches of old snow. I am not waiting for winter to end anymore. He said it quietly to Dell or to the cave or to no one, and Dell made no response, and the echo of it moved through the rear chamber and was absorbed by the stone, the way the stone absorbed everything holding it without display, giving it back slowly over time. Outside, the valley was doing what valleys did when the hard season finished. Mud on the roads, water running in the draws that had been dry and frozen since November. The particular smell of ground that had been locked under snow for months, releasing itself back into the air. birds that had been absent making themselves known again in the brush along the lower slope. Leland took his hand from the wall and turned toward the passage. Tuck appeared in the entry at that moment, framed by the spring light behind him, tongue out and tail moving in the unhurried way of a dog that had done significant work and survived significant cold and had arrived at a morning in April with everything still intact. The old hound looked at Leland with the brown-eyed steadiness that had been looking at him for 11 years across a lot of country and a lot of weather, and then turned and went back out into the light. Leland followed him. The slope opened up beyond the cave entrance into the pale Idaho morning, and below and around them, the valley of Sawtooth Hollow went about its slow spring reconstruction. Repaired roofs and new chimney caps and fields that would be planted in a few weeks with seed that had been stored correctly and kept dry and was ready to go into ground that was almost ready to receive it. He stood there for a while, just standing the way a man stood when he had been inside a long time and had come back out and was not yet ready to move toward the next thing. Greta was down the slope a little ways talking with Hattie Grady, and the two women's voices came up to him clearly in the thin morning air, comfortable and unhurried, the voices of people who trusted each other and had no particular reason to rush. The sun was still low over the eastern ridge, coming in at a long angle that lit the snow remnants on the upper slope and made them bright against the dark rock above. In a few weeks, that snow would be gone. In a few months, the whole mountain would look like a different place from what it had been in November when he had first come up this trail with Tuck in a lantern to see what $10 had bought. It had bought more than he had calculated when he signed his name in the diner. He walked down the slope toward the sound of voices through the thin spring mud into whatever the next season was going to require of him. Loam Hollow breathed quietly behind him in the mountain, holding what it held, keeping what it kept ready for the winter that was still months away, but would come again as it always came and would find the valley waiting for it differently than it had waited before.